And once you've had a few fires, it's very hard to find an old airplane crash because things melt. But anyway, that probably it hit the mountain and it ricocheted off, and the main crash site was down in the canyon somewhere. But there was an experience that we all survived because we got out of there.
Did the fire cause the explosives?
Yeah, the fire itself that we started caused the ammunition to go off.
So it's kind of self-inflicted.
Right.
You told me you were hiking down the Gridley Trail one time after a fire and found a big piece of aluminum.
I'd like to comment on your story. I was here in World War II, and there were two P-38s that were dogfighting, and one of them crashed. And we hiked from, or walked from Lion Street, clear out to Gridley and up to the end of Gridley. And we did see remains of the airplane there. And I'm just wondering if it's the same one for the bullets that shot off or what. But as I understood it, they were P-38s, which was an unusual airplane at that time.
Well, I'm not certain what they were. I was told it was a P-51, but it might have been a P-38. But after the Wheeler fire, I was going down the Gridley Trail, and I found remnants of an aircraft up there, but I never saw the fuselage or anything like that. And of course, in a crash in the air, things go everywhere. So I never knew exactly where, what the pieces I found down on the Gridley Trail above Gridley Springs, and there's another spring above Gridley Springs. It was up in that area where I found parts,
Well,
but I never found the fuselage down there. But it made me wonder whether or not the crash that I had with the firearms going off was related to the parts way over down in the Gridley Canyon, which is possible,
That's
you know,
what
if
I
it's
was
up in the air
wondering.
high enough.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, I really don't know.
remember what I saw.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ranger Boggs. You guys want to talk about ice can stoves and other stuff? Mike, what is an ice can stove?
Well, I'll go ahead and tell my version, and then John can tell his. I'm sure his will be a little more accurate. The way I was told was, of course, in the old days, you all had ice boxes, right? You had an ice delivery man, so the ice came from somewhere. You weren't making it yourself. So most towns had a plant that made ice, and then at some point in time, and I don't know when, refrigeration was invented, and so the large ice blocks that were being delivered to your home were no longer needed. And so to make those large, very large ice cubes, which they would dice up, they had to have some sort of mold. And so what I was told was at some point when the big ice plant in the Santa Barbara area went obsolete because of refrigeration, they had a couple of choices. You know, one was just to send all the mold, which was made out of steel, to the salvage yard, or to make something out of it. And so they made something out of it, and Santa Barbara National Forest was being developed at the time. Lots and lots of campgrounds, and so they started using these molds for a stove instead of making ice cubes. Is that kind of correct, John?
That's right. You can see in the photo there's two sections of it, and most of the time they would bury the first section in the ground and put rock and dirt in there. That way it can't be moved around. And then they would have the fire in the rest of it. And those were a common stove in the backcountry around here. And still today, you go in the backcountry in different camps, you're going to find some of these ice can stoves still around.
What about historic structures in the Los Padres that you guys visited when you were tykes or Boy Scouts, teenagers?
A lot of you probably have been down into the Sespe at some point in time. As you remember, John Lagosino built the road into his cabin, which is at Hot Springs, and then at some point I'm not sure whether it was the water district or oil folks, they continued the road into the hot springs. And there was, when I was a kid, there were still structures at Cottrell Flat, and there was a number of structures back in Hot Springs Canyon. And of course, we had a number of floods, and that took the structures out of the Hot Springs Canyon. You can see, has anybody been in Hot Springs Canyon? You know, either driven or hiked? I think probably most of you. There's a big date tree back there, date palm, and you know, that's not native. And so somebody planted it next to their little cabins back there. But there was a number of structures back in the Sespe. There were some in-holdings. An in-holding is a piece of private ground in the middle of the National Forest. And there was some private property in Hot Springs Canyon, Cottrell Flat. Some of you may have went to a place called Cat Lady Swim Hole, which is just about 20 minutes from the current parking lot. That was an in-holding also. And that was in the 60s, and there was a lady there that lived there, and she had a lot of cats, and so they called her the Cat Lady. But, and of course, you know, Willits, you know, has structures today, a few of the old structures. The main cabin, which a lot of casinos had burned down, but there's still a few little structures there. And then one of the older structures in the area is Patton's Cabin, and that's currently owned by Thatcher School, and that's it's about 15 or 20 minutes down the trail from the trailhead. So that cabin, the Patton property, has been there for a very, very long period of time. And that's currently the only active in-holding, you know, in the Sespe, where there's actual structure there. The Willett Hot Spring area, which was owned by the Willets and the Lagosinos, they were bought out of that property in 1985. So that property there, which was an in-holding, that's Forest Service ground today.
Historic structures, Rick?
One little thing I'd like to add to what Mike said about the old Lago Marcino cabin. If you go to Bocali's in the East End, they have a bunch of old historic photos of Ojai, and they actually have a photo in there on the wall of that cabin. And if you don't exactly know what you're looking at, it might not mean anything. But if you look for this structure that's it's actually kind of nondescript. It's not even very charming or anything. It was kind of a tin shack, kind of a large building, really. So it's kind of a faded photo, but look for that at Bocali's. Well, one of the structures that I have some memories of that actually burned down a few years ago, a homeless man was living in a forest homeless man, is what was called the Madulce Station, or the Madulce Cabin, which isn't actually on the Ojai district. It's over into the Santa Barbara district, but you could get to it from the trails from our district, which is kind of up off of Pine Mountain. You go through Don Victor Valley via the Potrero Seco Road and go back in there. And as far as I know, the cabin was a couple miles from, is that it?
Yeah.
You're
Shall receive.
You're on it. Couple miles from any road, as far as I know. Some friends of mine back in 1978 or 9, we were doing it was actually meant to be a 100-mile trip, and we started at Naira Camp behind Santa Barbara. And the first 50-mile leg included this. And we were headed for Pine Mountain Summit, where we had a food cache. So after the first day of this trip, it started raining. And so we're walking up the Sisquoc River, and every day the river got higher and higher. And it was starting to get pretty dangerous. We had a minimum of gear. Being like 23 years old, we thought we were indestructible. So we had a leaky tent and a good tent. So we would trade off every night and have a huge campfire and dry out. So we're going along. We've never been to Madulce Cabin. We didn't know much about it or anything. And we come off out of a snow flurry. We'd been wet for days, basically. And we come down to this cabin, and it's like sitting there in the fog at the bottom of this trail, and we're like, this is unbelievable. There's a house with double hung windows and clapboard siding out in the middle of nowhere. So we burst in there, and there was a big pile of firewood, dry firewood, on the floor in what was, I guess you'd say, the living room. And we threw our packs down, and there was a kitchen in there with a wood cook stove. Now, mind you, this was not, 5-star. This was like quarter-star. But to us at the moment, it was really amazing to come across this. So in there was a table, and on the table was a candle holder, probably a candle on a rock or something. And underneath it was a piece of paper, and written on the piece of paper it said, "You just came off of Ma Dulce Peak, cold, wet, and hungry, and you found a pile of dry firewood and food. Please leave some food before you leave and restock the firewood."
Wow.
So we had a great, if not smoky, night because of the wood cook stove. And but those were great memories of Ma Dulce Station for us.
That shot of the cabin was taken right after the restoration in '93, and it was gorgeous at that time.
Rick?
Yes.
One time I was hiking back in that area, I think it was Nara, and down Victor, there's a schoolhouse back there. And I was just overwhelmed to think there had been enough people living back there for them to have had a schoolhouse.
That would have.
What Cricket's referring to, and maybe this is what you mean, and it was indeed on this trek that we took, is out of Naira on the Sisquoc, or above the Sisquoc, is what was called the Manzana Schoolhouse, which is still there as far as I know. And it's a pretty intact schoolhouse. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought it was part of a Mormon community that was back there.
Actually, that was a misnomer. It was
Misnomer.
Hiram Wheat was a religious leader, but it wasn't a Mormon.
Not Mormons. And it's interesting because down along the Sisquoc, below the Manzana Schoolhouse, at least when I went there in the late 70s, there were still wagon tracks going along the river as evidence of that time. And you could see a few